Alright, in this video we're going to take a look at creating our very own particle system, and then we're going to focus on the properties behind emission and particle energy. But first, as I take a look around our simple level here, you'll notice that we're not exactly in a basic, fresh Unity scene here. What you're looking at is the end result level that we created in our third-person character system videos, which really, we're just using it as a test bed because it's a nice big flat area, and it just so happens to already have a camera system that we can utilize to look around our world. And this will come in pretty handy while we demonstrate these properties. Not having this set up won't really be a hindrance. It won't be a hindrance to you at all. It's just a way that we're going to use to demonstrate some things. But I just wanted to give a quick second and just real briefly at least illustrate or describe what we're looking at here. So what is this, Lee?
Well, as you were saying, this is the level and our character that you get at the end of our third-person character control system series of videos. So we thought it would be a nice little thing to show the particles here, because we do have a camera that we can walk around, navigate, and show you what's going on with the particle systems. This particular series, if you're going, wow, I really want to learn how to do this, is available, maybe already on our website, but is at this time coming soon at 3D Buzz. And we walk you through the whole process of creating a character that's fully animated, that you can run around inside of a world with a camera that reacts with the geometry. It is going to prevent the character from being occluded. It detects when the camera runs into geometry, so it knows where the floor is, it knows where the columns are. The character is fully animated. She can jump. In this one, I believe she can climb as well. If you want to,
I'm not going to worry about that.
Yeah,
that's enough. That's
we've got lots of stuff that she can do.
Yeah, just to give everybody a rundown of kind of what you're looking at, and if it differentiates from what you're seeing, if all you have is a basic scene, I mean, that's going to be fine. All you really need is maybe just a floor at some point that we can collide from, but straight out of the gate, you don't even really need that.
Right.
So let's go ahead and get started with our particle system. As I mentioned earlier, a particle system is really just a game object that has a particle emitter, a particle animator, and a particle renderer. Now you can create these from scratch, or you can create a prefabricated one. If you go under Create Other, you'll see Particle System. I'm not actually going to do that. I'll create one from scratch, and it'll be the exact same thing. So let's go ahead and create an empty game object, which I will immediately rename to Particle System. Now I'm just going to add the necessary components.
You want to stop playing first, or?
Well, it probably helps, so that way when it disappears because I was playing when I created it, I can then create it again, and everybody can completely forget that I did that. No problem. Now let's go under Component. We'll jump down to Particles, and we'll create an ellipsoid particle emitter. Now you have two different types of emitter here. You have ellipsoid, and you have mesh particle emitter. I'm not going to go too far into each one of these right now. It's suffice to say, an ellipsoid is just going to be a spherical shape that you can use as the emission point for all of your particles. Basically, it allows you to put particles into your scene out of a little spherical shape that you can control the size of. And that's what we're going to be using for the most part. You can also emit particles from a polygon mesh, which can be very useful if you have, I don't know, like some sort of jet engine and you need to emit fire out the back of the engine. You can use a mesh particle emitter to do that sort of thing. But we're going to start with a basic ellipsoid. And now we have an emitter. It's right here in our scene. We can frame up on it. We can rotate around it. But it doesn't look like much, and right now it doesn't do anything. The next thing we need to do is add on a particle animator. In fact, if we skip the animator, which we can do, we can go straight for the renderer. And that will give us some particles, but notice kind of where they're being born and how things really aren't doing what we think they should.
Right. Well, if you remember, we created a game object from scratch.
Right.
So when we did that and moved it around, it has a position in space. So our emitter, though,
we're moving the emitter, yeah, but none of this stuff is updating over time. And that's where the animator is going to come in handy. Now, just to keep things nice and clean, I just wanted to show that if you add a renderer, you can start to see some particles, but their behavior is not what you want just yet. So I'm going to remove this for the time being, just so I can add these in the order in which I discussed them. So go back to Component, jump down to Particles, and this time I'll add on the particle animator, which seems to do nothing. It's doing something, we just can't see it yet. Now, on top of this, we'll add on our particle renderer, and now we start seeing all kinds of stuff. We have particles snapping into existence, snapping out of existence. If I move this particle system around, you see the point at which the particles are born starting to move around with us.
Right, they're now attached to our empty game object.
That's right. And I also want to point this out. Take a look at the shape that is kind of being created. As I kind of rotate around it here, you'll notice that there's a very spherical kind of shape that is being created by this emission. This is the very idea behind this ellipsoid emitter.
Right.
We can control the size of it in X, Y, and Z and stretch it out into all kinds of irregular sphere-like shapes.
Right, which is why it's called an ellipsoid emitter.
And not a sphere.
Exactly.
Yeah, but you can, again, I just want to make sure that you can see that shape, and it's starting to be created. As a matter of fact, if just real quick for the fun of it, I took my min emission, which we'll talk about a little bit more here in just a moment, and we kick this up to 200. It starts to really thicken out, and it becomes a lot easier to see. So anyways, let's just go ahead and set that back down to its default value, and let's talk a little bit about these first few properties within the ellipsoid particle emitter. The first one of these is emit. This is just an on-off checkbox. Now, I also want to mention this, and I should have thrown this out when we were in our little intro, but it's one of those universal truths that you just kind of have to know about Unity, and it applies itself to so many different aspects of components and game objects. But a lot of these properties, for more advanced particle systems, you're going to be talking to through script. For instance, if you have something like, I don't know, a torch on a wall that needs to ignite at some point, you're probably going to be using a script to toggle emission on and off at some point. So I want to throw that out there. A lot of these various properties, any of these various properties, you can change through script to alter the behavior of your particle system at some random point in your game.
Right. It adds a level of control that you don't have with just taking a particle system and throwing it in your world.
And the reason I bring that up is, so obviously we have the emit checkbox here, which literally, as you can see, is just an on-off switch for our emitter. And if you're not thinking about scripting, you might be, well, why is that useful? I mean, why would you put a particle system into your level and then turn it off? Well, you would do that if you didn't want that particle system to be doing anything when you first started playing. If you, let's say, again, you have like a little gas flame on a wall, like a little gas torch or lamp, and by default, when you first enter the game, it's not doing anything, and you have to go maybe light it or complete some set of tasks to actually go turn it on, then you need some game script to reach over and actually affect that emit property and turn on your particle system.
Right. And conversely, if you were building a game that, let's say, the level was raining, you want the rain to already be in existence.
Mm-hmm.
So you don't want to start the game, walk outside, and then all of a sudden it starts raining every single time you start the game. This is something that can only be affected through scripting. You
Right.
can pre-simulate your particle systems, but it can only be done through scripting.
Right, and that's something a little bit outside the scope of what we're discussing here, but that is true. It's one of those things about particle systems that can only be achieved through script. Now, I don't mean to diverge too far away, but we can certainly see the emission activity of turning this on and on with just these bright magenta, pink, whatever color these are, particles. But really, that's Unity's default when you don't have a material applied. So let's go apply a material. To do this, I'm going to scroll all the way down to the bottom to that particle renderer we added just a few moments ago. And underneath the materials property, you'll see we have a size of 1 and our element, which is currently set to no materials. Now, I want to point out that under my standard assets, you can see that I have loaded in the particles standard asset. This comes along with Unity. If you don't have it, you can simply go up underneath Assets and Import Package and load that. It'll be found wherever your Unity installation is located, or if you create a brand new project, you can go ahead and just load it right away. Now, I'm just going to pop underneath my little load button here next to element 0, and we have some particle shaders, or particle materials, that come in because of that package. We have things like fairy dust, additive fire, we have smoke, flame, sparks, all kinds of cool things to play with. I'm going to grab fairy dust. It's kind of like your basic particle. It's just a tiny little glowing point in space.
Right. If you were to use the new game object particle system, it's the default settings that you would come up with.
And this is generally what it's going to look like if you create one from the actual particle system. So if I double click and add fairy dust to these, you see what these look like. It's just a little tiny glowing sparkling point. And just to illustrate what Lee just said, if I come over to game object and go to create other and make a particle system, it's already got default particle applied. Now notice the material's called default particle, but if we come over and look at the one that has fairy dust applied, you'll see that they look very, very similar. It's pretty much the same thing. Now I'll go ahead and delete this guy because we're not really going to be working with him. Okay, so back over here. Something else, just a cool little factoid about working with particles in Unity. We're not playing right now, but if you have a particle system selected inside the view, it will simulate so you can see its motion. It's a very, very handy feature, and you can select it by clicking on it here inside the hierarchy view, or if you click on any one of the particles, that will register as selecting the system. So it's just a neat way to actually see the behavior changes.
Right, and if you also look closely, now that he's got a texture on it, you can see where we're whiteboarding, and if you go in closely, you can see the actual polygon faces that surround the center point of the particle.
That's right. Now, moving on, we talked about emit on and off. That's pretty easy. Now, I'm actually going to jump down to min and max emission. These allow you to control how many particles are emitted per second. And by having a min and max value, you have a random that you can apply. So if we set this to, say, 10 on the min and 100 on max, this means at any given second, we're getting somewhere between 10 and 100 particles being fired into our scene. If you don't want a random value, if you want a constant, you could set these both to the same value. So now every single second we're getting 100 particles.
Right. And another thing to mention is we were talking about all of these parameters are accessible from scripts. They're also animatable.
That's true. Now, I don't want to get too far off the beaten path, but that's something I'll actually show at the end of this video. How's that? So we'll come back. I'll show you how to at least animate your emission value. Now, I'm going to move up from here. It's almost like an order of relevance because we talked about emit being on and off, and now we've talked about min and max emission being emission per second. The next important thing I want you to know about is energy. Now, energy, as far as I'm concerned, and this is just because I'm a Maya person, and maybe if you're a Maya person or even a Max person or somebody who comes into Unity from a 3D package, the term energy can be a little misleading. When I'm thinking of particles and I hear the word energy, my brain immediately goes to motion. But that's not the case here in Unity. Whenever you read energy in terms of particles, you are thinking about lifespan, how long these particles are going to live. Now, by default, this is set to 3, so each one of these particles are living for 3 seconds and dying. We can set this to 1 and 1, and now each particle is living for exactly a second, and you'll see that they're dying off a whole lot more quickly now. The min and max allow for a random range, so if we set this to 5, each particle, the moment it's born, is assigned a total lifespan of a random range between 1 and 5, and that's how long it'll live. So some particles will live as long as 5 seconds, and some will die off after 1 second. There'll be a random spread in between those. Very nice if you need some kind of randomization in how the particles are dying off. Now, from here, I also just want to point out, if you mouse over, you can see this. You can set your particles to live forever, so you can type infinity in there. Generally, you never want to do this. I can't imagine a situation where you really want your particles to never, ever, ever, ever die. So have a lifespan, find one that makes sense, and remember that going overboard with particles causes a lot of excess calculation on your machine, and by having them never, ever die off, you could be running into some problems. Now, that said, there may be some very special cases where you want them to live infinitely and kill them off through other means. By killing off the game object, literally specifically going in through script and killing off the particles. There are a lot of different exceptions to the rule, so I don't want to say you should never do it, but in most circumstances, infinity is not going to be helpful to you.
Right. The only time that I've ever used that is in conjunction with another parameter that we'll cover later, which is one shot, which brings all your particles in at one point in time, and then you never emit after that point. Because if they live forever and you're constantly emitting particles, you will bring your system down to a crawl.
All right, now this brings us up to min and max size, which is pretty self-explanatory. This just allows you to control the size of the particles the moment they are born, and by default this is set to 0.1. Now, I can set this to a pretty high value, but it's going to actually be capped out. And while I don't want to get too far off of a beaten path, I will show you about that, and then we'll have to come back to it again later. If I set these to 2 and 2, you'll notice our particles get a lot bigger. In fact, they end up turning into more or less a white glob because they're all kind of stacking on top of one another. So let's pull them all back down to about 0.2. and give them a second to die off because it still has that lifespan to take into account. And you can see that they're bigger than they were. Now, there is an interesting thing going on here, because if I set these to something ridiculous, like, I don't know, let's say 50 by 50, note the size that we're getting is pretty close to where it was a moment ago. I can set these to, I don't know, let's do something really insane like 5,000 by 5,000. And they're not getting any bigger. If you're playing with that and you're wondering why the particles aren't getting any bigger, again, it causes us to have to kind of jump over to another set of particles, another set of properties. But it's something I wanted to bring up. You have down in your particle renderer a max particle size property. And what this does is this controls the largest percentage of overall screen space that a particle can dominate. By default, this is set to 0.25, meaning that your particles can't take any more than a quarter of your screen space in total size. What does that mean to you? Well, it means, like in this case, as I start to get really close to these particles, each one of the particles no single particle can be bigger than a quarter of my screen space. It gets to be a little hard to see here, and I'll talk more about that property later. But if you're wondering why you can't make the particles 5,000 meters wide each, that's why. And again, you'll see why as we get down to the particle render and start talking about its properties. All right, now, those are all of the properties I wanted to discuss here, just being emission, energy, and size. And just remember that energy is like your lifespan. Now, but I did say that before we left, I would take our emission rate and I would show you how to animate that down. In order to really show that, because we've got this kind of piling up, this stacking up of particles, which is getting a little bit distracting, I'm going to impart just a little bit of motion to the particles. So I'll come down to world velocity, which is something we'll talk about a little bit later. And I'm just going to drop, 5's a little much. Let's try 0.2. And that's too little. So let's just find just the right mix and say 1. Cool. I just want a little bit of motion just to help make this a little easier to look at. Because when the particles really start stacking up on top of each other, to me it gets a little distracting and a little hard to read what's going on. So right now we have a min and max emission of 100. Let's say we want to animate that for some reason. If I have the particle system selected, and what I'm about to show you will play true for any one of these properties you want to animate. I'm just going to go ahead and get it out of the way here in our first video by animating emission, and then if you have some other property such as velocity or tangent velocity, anything that you want to animate, you'll now know how.
Right, the same process is the same. Just like when the previous videos when we were covering animation, everything that's in a particle system is animatable, just like all the transform information that we played with before. That's right. Is animatable.
Now here we are in our particle system. What I'm going to do is close up transform. I don't want to animate the transform yet. We'll talk about that later. We're going to grab our min and max emission, either one of these, and let's click record. And of course it's going to ask me what I want to name this. And let's see, we're inside the assets folder, and let me jump to a new location here. So over in U, let me jump into our source assets, which has got all kinds of stuff in it. And we'll call this particle animation. And let's see, you need to save the file inside the project assets folder. Well, okay, it won't let me put it right where I wanted to, so I'll put it where it tells me to. I thought I could get creative there, and I just failed. So we'll just call this particle animation. And we can always delete it out later once we're done with it. So now let's scroll back down, and we'll take a look at our min emission. Now with this selected, all I'm going to do right here at time 0 is click my add keyframe button. I'll also do it for max emission at the same time. I'm just going to animate the two of these together for simplicity's sake, but you could animate them at two entirely different values if you wanted to get really creative. Now what we're going to do is over the course of 2 seconds, we'll just bleed that emission rate down to 0. So I'll drag my time slider over here to 2 seconds. I'll take my min emission, set it to 0, take my max emission, set it to 0 as well, and that's it. Boom, right there. You can see how my particles die off. So we can stop our animation. Go ahead and close this. Now, you're not going to see the result of this right now. This is not really playing back the way it would play in the game. This is just simulating the particle system to help you see how your changes in properties are affecting your particles. If I hit play, however, and we watch, over the course of 2 seconds, our animation rate bleeds off to 0 by 0. And we're still getting one little tiny particle popping out per second, because if we wanted this to actually bleed off to nothing, we'd need to kill off that emission factor. So that is a quick look at animating all of our particles, which again is just kind of a bonus. What I really wanted to get across here is the properties of emission and energy and size, and then your little emit checkbox. So that will wrap things up for this video. Thanks a lot.